Hello and welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today we're going to have Katie Jenison back in and we're going to talk about learning from the best. So what that means is we're going to talk about kind of the inspiration, how to find kind of those icons, those mentors, those people that kind of help fill your cup and help kind of generate that spark of inspiration and idea that keep your brand not only chugging forward, but kind of keep it calibrated to, your purpose and your why and kind of what it was that, kind of inspired you from the beginning to set out on this journey and to create something unique for your brand and your customers. So without further ado, thank you again, Katie, for joining me. And here we go. Hello, Katie. Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of finding that inspiration, learning from the best, and kind of finding ways to kind of keep the motivation high and to keep, kind of that abstract and that unique thought going for your own business. The idea that kind of brought us to this discussion is when I started putting my own business together and pulling together my vision board, I started to kind of piece together these people that inspire me, people that I follow, people that I thought had a unique take or an interesting story behind what they had accomplished in their careers. And what I found to be kind of, maybe it was more odd at the beginning, is that I kind of found myself steering away from all the typical inspiration that people find, and by typical, I would mean, I think a lot of people migrate towards what's trending in the entrepreneurial world or within their industry, whether it's the Tony Robbins or the Elon Musk or whatever it is. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but I think there is a next level or a kind of an eccentric value of finding those ones that speak directly to you and find the ones that kind of dance on the line of that same entrepreneurial rebel type mindset that you might have in going into your own business and creating something from scratch. So at that point, that's when I kind of realized, like, man, this kind of looks weird, but I can actually justify why I do follow these people, why I find these people inspirational, why I find their story or their message or kind of their backgrounds similar to my own and or the journey that I'm on as an entrepreneur. So with that, I've shared my vision board with you, and you can kind of see who those people are, and I have it up in front of me as well, so we can kind of talk about some of the oddballs maybe. So with that, I'll kind of turn it over to you, see what questions you have, and we can kind of flesh this out a little bit further and help people understand kind of what the difference is and what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. So I think the first time we talked about this as a topic was probably almost a year ago. And I think at the time you did kind of mention some of those bigger recognizable brands like Amazon and Apple and that kind of thing. And as time went on, I started to notice you talking about brands that I had never even considered as a brand. For example, Evel Knievel. I never would have thought of him as a brand, but now, looking back, it does make sense that he has this personal brand that he built. And so I guess when it comes to identifying the best, like you said, it is pretty subjective and depends on the industry that you're in and what you surround yourself with. But in your mind, what's the differentiator between those big brands that are recognizable and the ones that you automatically think of when you think of branding or marketing versus a personal brand or a smaller scale like Evel Knievel? And not that he's not recognizable, but it's just not something that comes to mind.
Right. He's not the easy button, right, when it comes to looking for inspiration. Well, first of all, like, I think that, whether it's Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whoever it is, I think even those mainstream obvious type guys, I think they can, they can share a ton of value. And I think following them is awesome. And I think you can learn a lot from kind of, studying the way that they did what they did. I just think that everybody else is studying the same thing. So what's going to make you different, or what are you going to take from that? I'm not saying don't study them. I'm just saying, what else are you looking for? What else is super unique to you? What else what is it about them that attracts you to them besides the fact that they've just created these monster brands? Like for me, the Jeff Bezos, the Steve Jobs, like I like them for all the same reasons everybody else does. But why I really like them is because of their rebel spirit and how when they started what they started, they went against the grain and they paddled against the current pretty much the entire way until it worked and until it became what it became. And now all of a sudden everybody thinks it's so obvious. Like, they're like Steve Jobs. Well, yeah, I mean, it's Apple, it's this. And we talk about it like it was almost like a winning lottery ticket. And it wasn't. Like it was, I don't want to say miserable, but it was a challenge for him to get it to where it is. And that kind of snippet in time is kind of what I like about Steve Jobs, and it's the part I study about Steve Jobs. I've read a few books about him. I've seen the movies, the documentaries, all these different things. And after he accomplished what he accomplished, I'm not saying that isn't interesting, but that's not the interesting part that I apply to my business. It's the grit part. And
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to like, the more obscure stuff, whether it's Evil Knievel or Tinker Hatfield or some of these guys, that's what I really love about these guys is because they're doing stuff in a time and place where A, nobody else was doing it, and B, 99% of people out there thought they were nuts.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to do something that other people couldn't conceptualize or couldn't even wrap their brains around. So like just Evil Knievel himself, like, yeah, I mean, he did some really crazy things. But
Mm-hmm.
like when I think about Evil Knievel and some of the things he did, I think about the business decisions that I make and my clients make. And I'm thinking, well, what's the probability that we're overthinking things or making too big of things when this guy sat on a motorcycle that was not equipped to be jumping buses and cars and whatever? Like that's guts. Like that's a decision right there.
Mm-hmm.
So putting that into perspective, putting that concept in my mind, I think, man, this decision probably isn't that hard. I need to stop overthinking it. I need to pull the trigger. I need to hit go on this so that I can get to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of stuff that I try to extract from each one of these people is they were doing things when, like I said, when other people were probably not on board or even understanding what they were doing, yet they faced that fear, they made those decisions, and somewhere along the line it started to make sense and their vision started to come to life, and now all of a sudden they're icons, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're trying to do with branding is we're trying to make these brands memorable. We're trying to make them stand out in their industry. So going from a Steve Jobs to a Evil Knievel, it's about finding that differentiation and finding something that's unique to you so you can stand out.
So it's not just about your actions from a marketing standpoint, like your branding and that kind of stuff. It goes beyond that and is about thought processes and kind of like going back to that why behind the decision making and using that to guide you in your own brand.
Yeah, I think it's, whether you're an entrepreneur or a brand, I think you have to surround yourself with people that think like you. And sometimes that's hard. It's hard to find team members. It's hard to find, um, colleagues that are on your same page. And that's where this inspiration and stuff comes in is, even though I can't spend time with them, I can't talk with them, I can't necessarily be with these people, I can find and glean off the inspiration or the guts of an Evil Knievel or a Jim Henson or a, whatever, a Tinker Hatfield, some of these people who did things that were completely out of the box. And you're thinking, man, if I'm going to push the envelope and make my brand something special, who am I going to find that's done that before? And when you start looking, um, it's not hard to find. I think the challenge is finding those that speak directly to you. So if you're a car guy, sports guy, maybe it's by industry, finding people that, kind of took the hard path, a similar path as yourself, and found different ways to be unique and stand out.
Going back to those big brands, it seems kind of obvious given that they're instantly recognizable, whether by their branding or their messaging. But what makes them so successful? And I know that you are talking behind the scenes, but just from that connector with their audience. What are they doing that creates that connection?
I think it's the persistence of pursuing their vision, no matter how different it is. Like I think of, brands that started out completely different than where they ended up, like a Nike or a Patagonia, or even a personal brand like a Bruce Lee or somebody like that, that they just had a vision and a approach that they were going to make or take in their life. And even though people chiseled away at them, like, oh, don't do that, the industry wants this, oh, you should change this, you had people trying to nudge them in all kinds of different directions. And I'm sure that they took some of that advice along the way, but more times than not, they stayed the course and they stayed true to their vision. And only by doing that did they start to educate and pick up brand lovers along the way, because people start to then notice the difference. They start to notice that you're not just stepping into the mainstream of what everybody else in the industry is doing. And most businesses, most brands, most companies, we all claim to be different. We all say, well, I'm different because of this. So now the question is, are you really different? And if so, prove it.
Mm-hmm.
Now you got to stick to that path. Because if you start to waver, if you start to step back into the rut and step back into what other people are doing, you're not that different anymore. So
Right.
it's that persistence, I think, that's really key to that. And really, to take it back to that why, is shining a bright light and bringing those things that are different to the surface. Lead with those things.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of answered my follow-up, but just to kind of get into it a little bit. So why do you think what makes them so successful doesn't work for other brands that try to emulate them? And I don't mean necessarily like straight up copying what they're doing, because, you can tell in branding and messaging when that message is inauthentic and it doesn't really, speak to the core values of a brand or a company. But you can often pick out one or two things that someone is doing really well and try to apply those things in your own business, and it doesn't always work out. So why do you think that is? And is there a way that someone can take those elements and flip it to make it more successful for their brand?
Yeah, I think that when you're a thought leader, or if you're on the track of creating something unique, and it's a vision that's your own and you're really crafting a new path, you're always going to be at a minimum of one step, if not two, three, four steps ahead of the competition, because nobody knows what you know. Nobody can get inside your head. And the competition, even though if they come behind you, try to pick up on those things and try to mimic them, they're always going to be a day late and a dollar short, because you're the thought leader. That's why it's important that I think a lot of businesses can find success and be successful by just copying everybody else, but they're always going to be a day late and a dollar short to the big thing, to the big
Mm-hmm.
brand, to the big payoff, because at some point you have to start pulling away from what everybody else is doing. And again, there's a lot of businesses out there that can be successful just following everybody else and just kind of staying in the box, and that's fine. But for those people who want to create impact or create something that's unique and special and different from everybody else, you have to find ways to continue to inspire yourself and to keep that thought leader process and mindset going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really hard, and that's when the competition goes, why didn't we think of that? How did they get there and we didn't? Well, it's not necessarily a contest you can win, because again, that thought leader mindset, if that's inside that guy's head and he's got a unique vision, how was anybody to know?
So, looking at the vision board that you have 12 lessons in leadership. What do you think are some of the most important things that someone can learn from watching a successful brand or business?
One of my favorites and why he's on the board is Richard Branson, and I think it's that team spirit. Richard Branson seems like an obvious one, right? Because he's Richard Branson, and people are like, well, yeah, he's Richard Branson. But if you've read, anything about him, read his books, kind of read his philosophy behind Virgin, it is so bizarre to the point of like, how did he even craft business from his vision? Because his vision is all about, it's about being a thought leader and being a front runner in the industry, but it's really all about teamwork and experience and culture. And like, it is such a fluffy approach to everything that somewhere in there, he's found ways to either bring in the right people or create business structures that completely work within his culture. So like his teaching, so to speak, when you like read his books and read about him, it's incredible how just kind of what a thought leader he was at an early age about, teamwork and just overall culture and having fun. Like that was like the biggest thing that he, really taught and really made sure that was apparent in everything he did. And I think it's a huge part of who that brand is. And now, because of that mindset, because of his thought leader, personality, here he is, a much older man, and he's still kind of outdoing the younger guys. He's still doing a lot of cool things because he's never lost his focus and he stayed on that track. Kind of coming back to that pyramid, I think one of the things that why John Wooden is on here, one of the stories I always loved about John Wooden that I think is definitely it's old school, but at the same time, it kind of teaches you is that whenever John Wooden would bring his kids back to start the basketball season that year, everybody started at zero. So everybody sat down, they sat down in the auditorium and he taught them all how to tie their shoes, how to put their socks on, how to like, he went all the way back to the basics for everybody. And there's several stories out there of different players, whether it was, Bill Walton or whoever that had kind of been there, done that tried to, basically reject the teachings. Like, come on, I don't need to know how to put my shoes on. And for him, it was an exercise of discipline, but it was an exercise of kind of coming back to the basics, kind of finding that center, calibration, finding your why. It's about everybody's going to get on the same page here, and we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to get everybody caught up on what, kind of the protocol is. And once everybody understands what that is and they understand the vision, now we can go forward consistently. So like very old school approach to it. But I think the lesson there is that we got to get everybody on the same page and everybody going forward with that vision, which in the sports world, in the basketball world, was very unique. I wouldn't say John Wooden was a rebel by any means, but he definitely did some things that were unique that separated him from everybody else. And I think it took a lot of people to figure out, they had to lose to figure out why or what it was he was doing that was so different. And now, if you talk to any basketball coach or anybody that's, fully loves the game of basketball, A, they're going to know who John Wooden is, and B, they've probably stolen, numerous teachings from John Wooden. And that's a huge compliment. That just means that at some point he was the thought leader. He was the guy that was doing it different. And he was the guy that was, really executing on these things to make a difference in his work.
That is a really cool story.
Yeah.
I didn't know who John Wooden was, to be honest.
Well, and he's another one where like when I first started reading leadership books and reading entrepreneurial books and stuff, it's the whole lesson of don't judge a book by its cover. But I picked up a couple John Wooden books and I'm thinking, it's got this nice old white-haired man on the cover. And I'm thinking I don't know if this is a bedtime story, but it wasn't like the sexiest book cover I've ever seen. But when I started to read it, like, yeah, I mean, it was a great read all the way through. But the way I think about business and the way I've kind of wanted to craft my brand over the years, there was just all kinds of little solid nuggets in there that I could take from. And that's my example. But like, I think, what we're talking about today is what is that for you? What is that for somebody else? And just finding whoever that is that can inspire you, that you can extract from. Now, I've gone through and read those books, and I've studied these people, and I can converse on them pretty easily, but I also reference them. Like, I'll go back and pull those books out and look at the different things I've highlighted, or look at, I'll go back and reference those things when I need to, because, we're all learning, and the learning game never stops. So coming back to those sources that kind of helped me craft the vision in the first place keeps me calibrated to my goal.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it kind of ties into one of the lessons on this graphic is little things make big things happen. So you have to go back and look at those little steps that you took that eventually led to bigger and better things. And also remember that it may seem insignificant now, but going forward, it can have this huge impact on where you're trying to take your brand and your business.
Just to kind of throw a cap on that, like one of the quotes I love is from Walt Disney, and he says, "I only hope that we never lose sight of the one thing, that it all started with a mouse." What I take from that is, like, we get swept up, right? We're entrepreneurs. We're in our business. We're directing a team of people within a company, a marketing team, whatever it is. We've all got big goals, big visions, big plans, and we forget why it started. We forget the why. We forget the center. We forget the calibration. So, like, what I love about that is Walt Disney is a household name. People talk about Disney World, Disneyland, the fact that Walt Disney bought Marvel. You talk about all these things, and now the idea of Walt Disney is so massive. It's like Apple to some degree, where it's almost inconceivable to think about it as a startup or as a guy in his garage, drawing a mouse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how crazy is that?
Right.
So you take that one quote, it makes me think about, 5 years ago when I started my own business. You take it all the way back to the beginning, you rewind the clock for a minute, and you think, okay, yeah, this is why I did this. This is why I started. It keeps it on course. And that's what's cool about when you find these people that speak to you, and find these people that their message can resonate with your own journey, because you can always revisit it, and I'll come back at it, because we're all human. We're all going to get swept up in the process. We're all going to have to pay the bills, do our taxes, work with clients. Like, all of that starts to muddy up the purpose, right? So we gotta come back and remember why.
Right. Yeah. And I think even for me, I've only been in my business for 3 years now, and I get those moments where, I get overwhelmed and I feel like I can't do all of the things that I want to do, but it helps to kind of take a step back and think about where I was 3 years ago when I started and where I am now. So even though there are those moments where I feel overwhelmed, I can still see the progression that got me to the point where I am. And I can look back and say, well, what decision did I make to do this? And why was that important? And can I replicate that somewhere else? And I think that, it is hard sometimes to be an entrepreneur and to try to grow a business from the ground up. But when you look back at those things, it really drives home that this is what I want to do. And this is something that I want to keep doing. And how can I do that?
I think it's okay to fail. Like, you're overthinking these things, and you're kind of coming to these places where you're trying to keep motivated, trying to make the right decision, trying to not screw it up, all these things. But at the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen?
Right.
Mistakes are going to happen, and they're inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
So if this one's a failure, if this decision's a failure, so what?
Mm-hmm.
And not to keep bringing him back into it, but, like, I think about the Evel Knievel all the time. Like, I think about, him sitting at the end of a ramp on a motorcycle, not equipped to be doing what he's doing. And if he screws it up, could die, could be paralyzed, could break his legs, could break his arms, could probably going to spend months in the hospital.
Right.
He's sitting there revving his motorcycle up, ready to make one decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm worried about, do I buy a new computer, or don't I? Can I afford it? Oh, I don't know. And I think about, okay, what's the worst going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Pull the trigger. You got to pull the trigger, because, like, And Evel Knievel is just one example, but there are people making decisions out there all the time that are far more scary than the one I'm about to make.
Yep.
Pull the trigger. What's the worst that's going to happen, right? So I think about that stuff, and I think that's where some of these inspirational things, they become kind of fun when you have those reference points to come back at, because then you start to realize how maybe small some of these decisions are. I mean, we
Right.
can't help it, right? We're human, we're going to overthink them, but when
Hmm.
you really think about it in the big scope of things, in the big picture, they're not that big a deal.
Right. And I think that's something that that I struggle with is making decisions and taking that leap. I overthink things a lot, but that's something that I'm learning too. And now you've kind of taught me a little bit more about Evil Knievel and given me that actual tangible thing to think about. And you know, it's not the worst thing in the world if I do this one thing that's maybe scary for 5 seconds. Um, and I think I'll probably use that going forward too. And that's going to be at the forefront of a lot of decision making processes for me now.
Yeah. Well, I think intentional failure is scarier than accidental failure.
Hmm.
Like when you screw up on a daily basis and it was a complete accident, we can shrug that off pretty easy.
Right.
But when you're given a choice, you know, the blue pill or the red pill, when you pick the wrong one, now it's like, oh my God, what did I do? And you're very hard on yourself. But we
Hmm.
have to remember a failure is a failure. Like a mistake is a mistake, and we learn from them. We punch through them. But intentional failure is tough because we take so much, we take it so personally.
Right.
Where accidental failure, like I said, we do it all the time. We do it all day, every day, but
Hmm.
we don't give it much thought. We just move on.
Right.
We need to do more of that. As a marketing professional who works with brands, I tell my clients that all the time. Like nobody's trying to make mistakes, but when we do, you got to move on. You got
Hmm.
to take what you can from it, learn from it, pivot, adjust, calibrate, and go on to the next thing because it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Definitely. I think, yeah, I agree. It's important to not wallow in your mistakes, but to actually take out those key points and learn from them so that you can avoid them in the future, or else you can pivot and turn them into a positive.
Yes, totally agree.
So getting back to like specific learn from the best type stuff, I think it's pretty obvious that you think of the most recognizable brands when you're thinking of learning from the best in terms of branding and marketing. Um, but I think that we often forget about the little guy, so to speak. And those are those brands that are killing it on a local level, whether it's in your community or a smaller scale. What do you think are the advantages of being a big brand versus a local brand and vice versa?
I don't know if we've talked about this on the podcast, but I'm sure I've probably said this to you before, is that even if you're not $1 million brand, I fully believe you can look like $1 million brand. So when I look at branding, I mean, yeah, common sense tells me there's big brands, small brands, whatever, but on the surface, they're all the same to me. I feel like a small brand can look just as powerful and just as dominating as a big brand. It's just how dialed in is their message, how tight is the aesthetics, the design, the look, the feel. I just don't feel like they're at any disadvantage as compared to the bigger brands.
Hmm.
Now, I will say that the bigger brands have more resources, more dollars to throw at it, some of that stuff, but that doesn't necessarily affect what you can do from an aesthetic standpoint, what you can do from a messaging and content standpoint. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, they're all free.
Hmm.
Nike doesn't pay any more for that stuff than we do. Um, so there's a lot of things that are within our control that we can compete with, that doesn't matter if you're big or small. And that's one of the things I enjoy about marketing and the work that we do, is because we're all trying to get to that level, right? We're all trying to be Nike or whatever it is. But we can look like Nike from day one if we want to.
Hmm.
And that's what's kind of cool about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I was lucky enough to get to work with Nike a handful of times. And when I worked with Nike, one of the things that I thought was so fascinating is that I went into that total, like I was like a teenage girl going to a Backstreet Boys concert. I was thinking this is going to be the coolest thing I've ever done in my life. And it was cool. I will say it was cool. However, I was a little blown away by how normal it was. Like I
Mhm.
was coming from my job where we had these meetings where we sit and we brainstorm about how are we going to grow this, how are we going to do this, oh that's not going to work. Very normal stuff, right? These brainstorm, let's try to figure it out type conversations. And I don't really know what I expected, but I expected like something way cooler. So when I met with and had these discussions with people from Nike, it was exactly the same as if I was having that discussion with everybody else. And I was like, wait, so you just put your pants on one leg at a time like everybody else? That's weird. You're Nike. And it was really eye-opening. And it was cool to kind of have that revelation, but at the same time, I realized that man, I am as much of a fangirl or a victim of this whole thing as everybody else is, which helped me realize that in branding and in brand creation and in design, we're all on the same page. We're all in the same boat.
Mhm.
Like all these amazing ad campaigns that you see developed from Nike, the logos, they're all using Photoshop, just like me. There's always one guy behind the mouse and behind that monitor designing that logo, just like me. And they're all throwing it on their Facebook page, which is free, just like mine. So when
Mhm.
you start to think about that stuff, it's like you can really, I don't know, you can really take your vision in some ways up 10, 12 notches because there's really nothing holding you back from being that level of a brand. So
Mhm.
small brands, big brands, mom and pop shops, you can look every bit as cool, if not cooler than everybody else if you choose to. So like I tell my clients this, I tell a listener this, is that don't water down your own expectation of this because you're a small brand or a mom and pop or not a franchise or whatever, because you can look every bit as good as everybody else. And that aesthetic, that brand kind of vision and getting that to come to life in a way that makes you look like $1 million brand, it does matter.
Mhm.
Aesthetics matter. And yeah, I mean, I think there's all kinds of small brands and there's all kinds of small businesses that just kill it in that way. But you just have to realize that you can do it just as good as anybody else.
There's that limited or limiting belief where my brand will never be as big as this brand because I don't have the same resources, but you may not have the same budget, but you do have the same resources because they're using the same channels that you can use.
Hmm.
And you have to let go of, will I ever be like them? And how can I be like them in my own way?
Yep. And I think on that track is that's exactly where all these guys started from.
Hmm.
I don't know that smart guy, but I don't know that Steve Jobs truly understood what it was he was building when he started building it. I don't
Right.
think that Tinker Hatfield, when he was designing shoes for Nike, truly understood how iconic his vision of things would become 20, 30 years later.
Right.
I don't think, I just don't think anybody quite knows that at the beginning, but
Hmm.
it's about not putting shackles on your brand and not limiting yourself. Just find that inspiration and stick to the plan, stick to the vision, and who great things happen. I mean, that's what it's about.
Yep. And it's going to take some trial and error, but those big brands are also testing things constantly and finding what works and what doesn't. And you just have to be able to do the same testing and retesting that they are willing to do.
Yep. And I would say even the big brands, not only are they studying their competition, but they're studying people that most people would not consider their competition.
Hmm.
I don't know who, I can't tell you who, but I would bet Nike, Adidas, Amazon, I would bet they have a hit list of brands that they watch that they believe are up and comers and people that might, teach them something, somebody that they could
Sure.
learn from. They're watching them. Why can't that be your brand? Why can't that be a smaller mom and pop brand? If they're killing it and they can learn from it, there's value there.
Hmm. And even if it's not somebody in the same industry or field as you can still learn from what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Like, even when you're finding these aspire to mentors or these people you want to put on your own vision board, or learning from the best, is you don't have to dial it into just entrepreneurs. You don't have to dial it into just people that change things in your industry. They don't even have to be mainstream people. It could be your dad or your uncle or your mom or whatever it is. It could just be somebody that you thought did it cool.
Hmm.
I'll throw a shout out to one of the brands that I follow is a little sandwich shop in New Hampshire called Johnny Boston's.
Okay.
I was out there for a trip. We went in there. He had $2 PBRs. We had a sandwich. I was just amazed at A, how small this little shop was, but B, how in tune he was as a brand. Like, most people would walk in this little shop and think, man, this thing is tiny. How can you run business out of here? Well, in his little town in New Hampshire where he's got this shop, he completely kills it. He's got his branding figured out, he's got his messaging figured out, and he's got a loyal community behind him that helps him sustain exactly what it is he wants to build. It's a really cool example of how he just took something very small, crafted it to be his own, and now he's got this little powerhouse brand out in New Hampshire. It's
Hmm.
it's a really neat. I mean, check him out online. I love watching his like sandwich videos. Like, he makes all these awesome sandwiches, and yeah, it's pretty funny. You'll have to check it out.
Yeah, I will. That kind of led into what I was going to ask you next is for some examples of those local, smaller businesses and brands that are doing really well. Locally for Fargo, I always think of, like we talked about last time, Drecker is doing really well with their branding, and watching them and how they interact with their audience and the people that follow them, I think is really eye opening too. But I always go back to Dash and White. I love Dash and White's branding and what Kelsey does for her business and how she uses her personality in everything that she does. And I think that's kind of a reminder, that you have to, especially when you're a small brand, put that personality and your story and what you're doing.
Yeah, Dash and White is a great example where they look like $1 million brand, but
Hmm.
yet they've just gotten started. They're a very new company. They're a very new brand. They look like $1 million. The branding, even though I can tell you from the inside, she's trying to figure it out. She's putting her own personality in it. She's, crafting her message, and because there just hasn't been that much time behind her, she's working on it, right? It's in development,
Hmm.
but the customer would never be able to tell the difference because it looks polished, it
Hmm.
looks dialed in, it looks consistent, and it's got, like you said, it's got her personality in it, which is the glue that holds it all together.
Yep.
And that's a great example of, most people would either see them online or stop into that retail destination and say, A, are you a franchise, or B, how long have you been here?
Hmm.
And I think most people would be shocked when when they found out it was probably less than a year. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think there's lots of examples like that. I think Dash and White's a great example. I've mentioned them before. Voodoo Donuts
Hmm.
they're a donut shop. And when you look at like who would be their mainstream competition, the Dunkin' Donuts, the Krispy Kremes, then you look at Voodoo as kind of this odd rebel in the whole thing.
Hmm.
Now, some people would probably argue that, well, that's so different. I don't know if that's a good idea. Then you'd get this other side that would go, well, it's an amazing idea because now they're so abstract that Krispy Kreme and whoever else is a competitor, they can't even touch it. They can't even compete in that. area or that space. So that's another good example. The Johnny Boston's is I think a great example. You'd mentioned Drecker. I think there's a lot of, like, I look at the food truck industry and a lot of what people are doing with like, the small breweries and the craft beers. You want to see some amazing branding and just some out of the box thinking. Look at food trucks and, brew houses.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have guts. They're doing some things that are very progressive and very bold, and their branding is awesome.
What's a takeaway that someone can use either professionally or personally that they can learn from?
Yeah, I would say the thing is that when you're finding this inspiration and you're finding those who, that you want to learning from the best, it's about finding those that are unique to you and finding ways to extract those pieces that you can then slip into your own vision or use to assemble your own plan. One of the quotes that I love from Bruce Lee is absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. So it's just that idea that you don't necessarily have to go all in on, one inspiration or one mentor or one, source of information. You can kind of piecemeal and extract the different pieces to kind of assemble something that's totally unique to yourself and your brand and your vision. And what's cool about that, or what I think helps keep that top of mind, is because you've created something unique then. So
Mm-hmm.
like when you're in those times of, or in those moments where you're challenged or you're in kind of one of those funks where you need to come back and calibrate, because you've kind of crafted something unique, it's going to be that much easier to access versus trying to look back at somebody else's thought process or somebody else's mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the thing. And just know that everybody's is going to be different. I've added and subtracted people over the years, and mine is constantly evolving. I think yours can too. Everybody's can. But it's just about having a handful of those inspirational resources that you can learn from and reference back to when needed.
For sure.
Thanks again, Katie, for being on the podcast. And just to kind of remind the listeners, this podcast is designed to find inspiration, to talk about branding, to talk about the creative process and kind of the journey of calibrating and creating next level and memorable brands. So if you know anybody, whether they're an industry professional, maybe they're a marketing director at a company, maybe they're a startup, maybe they're their own business. If they could possibly learn from this podcast or get some inspiration from it, please like, share, comment, get it out there that it exists. And I would love to take any advice from the people out there of what topics they'd like to hear us cover on Brand Retro. They can email me at mike@cyberdogsmarketing.com or check us out online at cyberdogsmarketing.com. And again, please like, share, comment, and let's get